Did you ever notice how the villains from our childhood cartoons were way too intense? The 1980s gave us bad guys who looked like fever dreams, sounded like nightmares, and still echo in our memories like static from an old VHS. They didn't just want power, they wanted drama. These weren't just villains, they were icons of chaos wrapped in neon and thunder. So, dust off your action figures, dim the lights, and let's revisit 15 weird 80s cartoon villains who still haunt our childhoods. Mumm-Ra, Thundercats. Every decade has its monsters, but the 80s gave us one wrapped in bandages and thunder. Thundercats had its share of heroes, but Mumm-Ra, he was something else entirely. Imagine this, a decaying sorcerer, locked away in a crumbling pyramid, muttering to ancient spirits that answered only in echoes. His catchphrase, "Ancient spirits of evil," transformed this decayed form to Mumm-Ra the ever-living. Wasn't just a transformation spell, it was a whole mood. When those spirits answered, lightning cracked, his robes tore, and he became a towering, muscle-bound monster, powered by pure darkness. He wasn't charming, he wasn't funny, he was terrifying, and that's exactly why we loved him. Did you know Mumm-Ra was inspired by old-world mythology, part mummy, part demon, part fallen god? He didn't crave riches or fame, he wanted eternal life, control, and cosmic fear. Kids in the 80s weren't used to that kind of villainy. He didn't have gadgets or henchmen. He had centuries of rage. Mumm-Ra's real power, though, wasn't his strength. It was his persistence. No matter how many times the Thundercats beat him, he always came back. Always. Like every good childhood fear, he lingered in the corners of our imagination. And that design, those glowing red eyes, that raspy growl, that decaying cloak, it was nightmare fuel at its most elegant. In hindsight, Mumm-Ra wasn't just another cartoon villain. He was gothic horror for Saturday mornings, served with thunderbolts and reverb. Because here's the thing about Mumm-Ra. He didn't just fight heroes, he haunted them. And decades later, he's still haunting us too. Skeletor, He-Man, and the Masters of the Universe. If Mumm-Ra was fear incarnate, Skeletor was chaos with a gym membership. Blue-skinned, skull-faced, and endlessly furious, he was the kind of villain who could make a simple insult sound like Shakespeare gone mad. "He-Man, you're muscle-bound buffoon!" he'd bellow from his throne in Snake Mountain, lightning cracking behind him. And somehow, it was both hilarious and terrifying. Skeletor wasn't your average bad guy. He didn't want to destroy the world, he wanted control of Castle Grayskull, that glowing fortress of power. But what made him unforgettable wasn't his goal, it was his personality. He was part dictator, part comedian, and entirely unhinged. Did you know Skeletor's design came from a real-life childhood trauma? Artist Mark Taylor once saw a mummified corpse at a carnival sideshow as a kid, and that grotesque image stuck with him for life. Years later, it inspired the skull-faced sorcerer we all grew up loving and fearing. He wasn't just scary, he was magnetic. His every sneer, every hand gesture, every over-the-top laugh made him impossible to ignore. Skeletor could be menacing one second and hilariously sarcastic the next, and somehow, that unpredictability made him more dangerous. And let's not forget his lair, Snake Mountain, a talking, screaming stone serpent mouth that doubled as a fortress, the stuff of childhood nightmares and daydreams. But beneath the madness, Skeletor had depth. Some episodes hinted at his tragic past, a fallen hero corrupted by ambition. The skull wasn't just a mask, it was a curse. That's why Skeletor endures. He wasn't evil for evil's sake. He was the living embodiment of obsession, of ego gone wild. He wasn't trying to end the world. He wanted to rule it, pose on top of it, and look fabulous doing it. And decades later, we still quote him. We still laugh. But deep down, part of us remembers how uneasy we felt the first time that bone-white face sneered through the static. Because Skeletor wasn't just the villain of He-Man, he was the villain of the entire decade. Dr. Claw, Inspector Gadget, he was the villain you never saw. But somehow, you always felt him. Dr. Claw wasn't just Inspector Gadget's nemesis. He was a ghost in the machine, a shadow in the control room. Every time that gravelly voice growled, "I'll get you next time, Gadget," a generation of kids froze in delicious fear. And that's the brilliance of it. We never saw his face, ever. Just a metal gauntlet stroking a sinister cat as thunder rumbled in the background. It was genius in its simplicity, mystery as menace. In a decade when villains were loud, colorful, and theatrical, Dr. Claw was minimalism at its most menacing. He didn't need flashy armor or a dramatic entrance. One growl, one glare from that unseen chair, and the world of Inspector Gadget shifted from goofy to grim. Did you know the creators intentionally kept his face hidden, even in production art? They wanted him to feel omnipresent, less a man, more an idea. Some fans believed he was Gadget's dark mirror, a prototype gone rogue. Others thought he was just the embodiment of frustration, a villain doomed to lose every week, trapped in an endless loop of almost winning. That final shot in every episode, Dr. Claw retreating, shaking his fist at the screen, shouting his catchphrase, became a ritual, a promise. The villain would rise again. Even his voice, performed by the legendary Frank Welker, sounded like gravel soaked in smoke. It wasn't cartoon evil. It was a real menace, the kind that seeps into your subconscious and stays there. And that cat, Mad Cat, was the cherry on the eerie sundae. Cold, silent, and watching, like even it knew Dr. Claw was doomed to fail but loved the spectacle anyway. Decades later, we still don't know what he looks like, and maybe that's why he endures, because nothing you can draw is scarier than what your mind invents. Dr. Claw wasn't a villain. He was the idea of one, the perfect shadow haunting a generation of Saturday mornings. Cobra Commander, G.I. Joe. If chaos had a voice, it would sound like this: high-pitched, furious, unhinged. Cobra Commander wasn't your usual military mastermind. He was pure egomania, wrapped in a shiny metal mask. Every episode of G.I. Joe was a battle of ideals: freedom versus fear, courage versus control, and at the center of it all, there he was, shrieking orders to his army of goons, like a man who believed volume was the key to victory. "Cobra!" he'd roar, and kids everywhere knew something wild was about to happen. What made Cobra Commander so unforgettable wasn't his intelligence. He lost, constantly. It was his passion. He believed in his mission, even if that mission made zero sense. He wanted to rule the world not because it was logical, but because he deserved it. And in his own warped way, he almost made you believe it too. Did you know his voice actor, Chris Latta, also voiced Starscream from Transformers? That explains everything. The same piercing tone, the same theatrical rage. Cobra Commander wasn't just a villain. He was a one-man opera of frustration. He had the mask, the mirror-polished armor, and that sinister snake insignia. But beneath it all, he was oddly human, petty, paranoid, always scheming, always failing, but never giving up. There's something almost tragic about a man who keeps losing and still thinks next time will be different. In the 80s, when every cartoon villain was trying to look tough, Cobra Commander dared to sound like chaos itself. His voice was the brand. He didn't whisper threats. He screamed them like a rock star having a meltdown, and somehow it worked. Cobra Commander wasn't terrifying because he was powerful. He was terrifying because he was unpredictable. He could destroy your city or throw a tantrum about his uniform. And that's why he's burned into our memories. Behind every world domination scheme was the sound of glorious, over-the-top failure. Because deep down, maybe Cobra Commander wasn't fighting the Joes. He was fighting reality itself. And for a cartoon villain, that's about as haunting as it gets. Venger, Dungeons and Dragons. He rode across a stormy sky on a black nightmare steed, cloak whipping like smoke, one horn glinting under lightning. Venger wasn't just a cartoon villain. He was an omen. In Dungeons and Dragons, 1983, a group of kids are transported into a fantasy world after riding a theme park attraction. It's supposed to be an adventure, but from the moment Venger appears, it's clear this isn't the lighthearted kind. He's part demon, part fallen wizard, with glowing red eyes and a voice that seemed to come from the bottom of a cavern. Every line he spoke had weight, like it carried the echo of some ancient curse. "I am Venger, the force of evil." That voice, deep, deliberate, almost sorrowful, belonged to the legendary Peter Cullen, the same man who voiced Optimus Prime. Talk about range, one hero, one haunting. But what made Venger stand out wasn't just his design, it was his story. Beneath the armor and darkness, there was tragedy. In a late revelation, it's hinted that Venger was once a pupil of the mysterious Dungeon Master, his son. That's right. Evil and good, forever locked in a family feud older than time. For kids, it was mind-blowing. For adults revisiting it now, it's Shakespeare in armor. Did you know Dungeons and Dragons was once accused of being too dark for children? Venger was a big reason why. His presence made every episode feel like a shadowed fairy tale, one that dared to say, not every story has a happy ending. He wasn't evil because he wanted power. He was evil because he'd lost hope. And that's what made him linger, not as a cartoon, but as a warning. Venger wasn't just a villain. He was the ghost of potential, the kind of haunting that never truly fades. Tex Hex, Bravestar, space cowboys, laser duels, and moral lessons. Bravestar was already a strange brew, but then came Tex Hex, and suddenly it became a space western dipped in pure nightmare fuel. Tex Hex wasn't your typical outlaw. He was undead, unholy, and unnervingly stylish. A spectral cowboy with lavender skin, glowing eyes, and a voice that dripped with venom and dry humor. He looked like he'd wandered straight out of a ghost town run by aliens. In the 1987 series Bravestar, Tex Hex was the sworn enemy of the hero sheriff, a Native American lawman gifted with powers of the spirit animals. Together, they clashed across the planet New Texas, where the Old West met outer space. But Tex Hex wasn't just another gunslinger. He was tragedy in boots. Once a man, he'd been transformed into a ghastly creature by the evil spirit Stampede, a demonic entity who granted him power in exchange for his soul. So yeah, for a Saturday morning cartoon, this show went deep. Did you know Tex Hex was originally meant to be the villain in a totally different show by Filmation, but the animators found him too dark? Instead, they built an entire series around him. That's how haunting he was. His laugh was a rattle. His smile looked carved into his face. And yet there was something cool about him. He was the kind of villain who could make evil seem poetic. Tex Hex wasn't about chaos or conquest. He was about revenge, resentment, and regret, a ghost chasing the echo of his own humanity. And that's what made him unforgettable. He didn't just haunt Bravestar, he haunted the idea of redemption itself. In the bright, booming world of 80s cartoons, Tex Hex was that rare shade of gray, a walking reminder that even the worst villains were once human, before they became the stories that kept us up at night. Hexadecimal, reboot. Before the internet was a household word, Reboot gave us a villain made of pure digital chaos, Hexadecimal. Part goddess, part glitch. She was the queen of chaos, living inside the mainframe and ruling it like a mad monarch of code. But here's the thing, she wasn't your usual bad guy. Hexadecimal wasn't greedy or power-hungry. She was unpredictable. 1 second, elegant and soft-spoken. The next, screaming with laughter as her face literally cracked like glass. Because her face, her mask, changed with her emotions. Instantly, visually, disturbingly. For kids in the mid-90s, yes, technically late 80s style carried over, that was terrifying. No warning, no restraint, just a flash of emotion and a digital scream. Voiced by Shirley Milner, Hexadecimal was the kind of villain who made you both afraid and fascinated. She wasn't evil in the traditional sense. She was chaos personified, the living embodiment of instability in a world built on perfect code. Did you know the creators of Reboot modeled her after theater masks, tragedy and comedy, melding them into one? Every flicker of her face told you what the machines couldn't say. Emotion has power, even in a world of logic. And that voice, silky one moment, unhinged the next, made every scene unpredictable. You never knew whether she'd destroy the mainframe or simply giggle and vanish into pixels. Unlike most villains, Hexadecimal wasn't someone to defeat. She was something to understand. She existed beyond good or evil, like the internet itself, vast, uncontrollable, and beautiful in its madness. Decades later, she still stands as one of animation's most haunting metaphors, the face of instability in a world that worships control. Hexadecimal didn't need to rule the system. She was the system's reflection, its fear, its secret wild heart. And that's why we can't forget her. Mon Star, Silverhawks, take 1 part He-Man, 1 part Transformers, throw it into outer space, and you've got Silverhawks, a show about half-metal heroes defending the galaxy. But every hero needs a monster, and Silverhawks had one that shimmered in the moonlight, Mon Star. With a name like that, subtlety was never on the menu. He was part alien mob boss, part cosmic vampire, transforming under moonbeams into a steel-skinned terror with glowing red eyes and a roar that could curdle the stars. His transformation sequence alone was a masterclass in childhood trauma. Moonstar of Limbo, give me the might, the muscle, the menace of Mon Star, he'd scream, his flesh turning to metal, his wings bursting out as lightning crackled across the galaxy. It was heavy metal mythology, literally. Did you know Silverhawks was created by the same team behind Thundercats? They wanted to capture the same magic, this time in space. But where Mumm-Ra was gothic horror, Mon Star was rock opera, loud, brash, and impossibly cool. He ruled his world from the Limbo Galaxy's penal planet, surrounded by cybernetic henchmen with names like Yes Man and Buzzsaw. It was absurd, over the top, and completely unforgettable. What made Mon Star so weirdly enduring wasn't just his design, it was his attitude. He wasn't a scheming overlord or a tragic soul. He was a performer. Every fight, every growl, every pose was theater. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to dominate the stage. Mon Star was what you'd get if Mick Jagger, Darth Vader, and a lunar eclipse had a baby. And when he wasn't screaming for power, he sat on his floating throne, smugly basking in his own reflection, a perfect metaphor for every big ego villain ever drawn in the 80s. He didn't just threaten the Silverhawks, he haunted the very idea of heroism. Because in his mind, he was already the star. Mon Star wasn't about evil. He was about spectacle, and that's what makes him unforgettable. Queen Beryl, Sailor Moon. Before Sailor Moon conquered the world with friendship and moonlight, it terrified a generation with Queen Beryl, the dark empress who made evil look hypnotic. Picture this. Flowing crimson hair, glowing eyes, a gown that looked stitched from night itself. Queen Beryl wasn't just a villain, she was a presence. She ruled the Negaverse with elegance and fury, commanding monsters with a flick of her hand and betraying subordinates with a smile. For kids, she was dazzling. For adults looking back, she was something more, a portrait of obsession and power. Beryl didn't just want to conquer Earth, she wanted revenge, specifically against Queen Serenity and the Moon Kingdom, the rulers who cast her aside eons ago. Did you know her character was inspired by the myth of the scorned sorceress, a woman whose power and heartbreak fused into unstoppable ambition? Every frame she appeared in radiated that dangerous mix of beauty and bitterness. Her voice, smooth, deep, commanding, could shift from seductive to terrifying in seconds. One moment she was promising eternal glory, the next she was banishing her own followers into oblivion. And behind it all, she served an even darker master, Queen Metalia, the true force of destruction. But what made Beryl so haunting wasn't her power, it was her purpose. She believed she'd been wronged, that she was reclaiming a destiny stolen from her. That hint of humanity made her unforgettable. She wasn't chaos for chaos's sake, she was heartbreak turned cosmic. And that final confrontation, when Sailor Moon faced her, light versus darkness, love versus obsession, wasn't just good versus evil. It was innocence standing against pain. Queen Beryl didn't just command an empire of shadows. She was the shadow, the embodiment of every elegant nightmare the 80s ever drew. Hordak, She-Ra, Princess of Power. If Skeletor was the loud, campy face of evil, Hordak was its cold, calculating heart. In She-Ra, Princess of Power, Hordak ruled Etheria with a mechanical fist, part sorcerer, part machine, and completely terrifying. Where Skeletor yelled, Hordak whispered. Where others plotted, he commanded. His voice, deep, metallic, almost animalistic, carried authority. His design was unforgettable. Pale gray skin, red eyes, bat-like armor, and mechanical limbs that could transform into cannons and drills. He wasn't just evil, he was evolution gone wrong. Did you know Hordak actually trained Skeletor? That's right. In the tangled lore of He-Man and She-Ra, Skeletor was once Hordak's apprentice, before betraying him. Which means, technically, every insult Skeletor ever screamed was just his old teacher's lesson echoing back. Hordak didn't seek petty domination. He sought order through control, a perfect society under his rule. And that's what made him so unsettling. He believed he was right. His empire wasn't chaotic like Skeletor's. It was regimented, efficient, sterile. Even his laugh was mechanical. But his power came at a cost. Every new upgrade, every new machine part stripped away another piece of what was once human. He wasn't just the enemy of She-Ra. He was the embodiment of what she fought against. A world without compassion, ruled by cold precision. Filmation's animators leaned into the horror. The smoke-filled chambers, the flashing red lights, the eerie hum of Hordak's machines. Watching him was like watching technology turn sinister. Yet he was charismatic, a villain with gravitas. You couldn't help but respect his presence, even as you feared him. And in true 80s fashion, he was more than a bad guy. He was a warning, a symbol of what happens when power replaces purpose. Hordak wasn't just She-Ra's nemesis. He was the ghost of humanity's future, metal, merciless, and unforgettable. Baron Greenback, Danger Mouse. Before British humor conquered the internet, it conquered Saturday mornings, and standing proudly, or rather, squatting menacingly, in the middle of it all was Baron Greenback, the toad-like criminal mastermind of Danger Mouse. He wasn't tall, he wasn't strong, and he definitely wasn't glamorous. He was, however, brilliant as an amphibian with delusions of grandeur and a villainous streak a mile wide. With his velvet cape, piercing red eyes, and accent that slithered like smoke, Baron Greenback was the kind of villain who made evil sound sophisticated. His lair? A dark fortress nestled in some rainy corner of the English countryside. His goal? World domination, naturally, but done with flair, sarcasm, and impeccable diction. Did you know that Danger Mouse's creators designed Greenback as a parody of classic Bond villains? Think Ernst Blofeld, only smaller, greener, and with far more attitude. Even his pet, Nero the Caterpillar, was a twisted riff on the white cat trope. A creature so unsettlingly calm, it somehow made Greenback seem even creepier. But here's what made him unique. Greenback wasn't scary because he could win. He was scary because he almost could. He was competent, smart, organized, terrifyingly patient. He didn't scream or shout. He just waited, schemed, and hissed threats through that unforgettable voice that dripped with malice and dry wit. In a decade of loud villains, Baron Greenback whispered his menace, and that made him all the more haunting. He wasn't built to terrify children with monsters or magic. He did it with intellect, and the quiet certainty that he'd get you eventually. Baron Greenback didn't need thunderbolts or armies, just a plan, a smirk, and that unnerving laugh. He made evil feel classy and just a little too real. Megatron, Transformers. Some villains shout, some whisper. Megatron roared. If the 80s had a sound, it was that metallic snarl booming through CRT speakers as the Transformers logo blazed across the screen. Megatron, the leader of the Decepticons, was the embodiment of brute intelligence. Part machine, part tyrant, all domination. He wasn't a monster. He was a philosopher. Strength equals survival. Weakness deserves destruction. That was Megatron's gospel, preached through sparks and shrapnel. Voiced by Frank Welker, whose vocal cords might as well be classified as national treasures, Megatron's delivery was operatic. Every Decepticon's attack hit like a battle cry that made the living room shake. But his brilliance was in his contradictions. He wasn't just rage and power, he was cunning. He saw beauty in conquest, poetry in precision. Every battle wasn't just a fight, it was art. And when he faced Optimus Prime, it wasn't good versus evil, it was faith versus doubt. Did you know that in the original toy line, Megatron transformed into a handgun? That detail alone tells you everything about 80s animation. Loud, absurd, and totally unconcerned with realism. Kids thought it was awesome. Parents are not so much. But even beyond his design, Megatron had gravitas. He wasn't a bumbling villain of the week. He was the kind of character who believed he was right. He looked at Optimus's mercy and saw weakness. He looked at peace and saw stagnation. In his mind, chaos evolved. And that's what made him terrifying. He wasn't evil because he enjoyed destruction. He was evil because he saw it as necessary. When Megatron shouted, "Peace through tyranny," it wasn't just a line, it was his worldview. Cold, ruthless, and disturbingly logical. Decades later, he's still one of animation's greatest icons, a machine with a soul forged in conflict. Megatron wasn't just the enemy of the Autobots. He was the mechanical embodiment of ambition gone feral. And somehow, that spark of madness still hums in our collective memory, long after the screens went dark. The Boogeyman, the real Ghostbusters. He didn't hide under beds or in closets. He owned them. For many kids, the real Ghostbusters was a fun spin-off of the hit movie, ghosts, gadgets, and a few laughs. But then came the Boogeyman, and everything changed. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't even dead. He was fear itself, a nightmare given form, feeding off children's terror and thriving in the dark. With his long, spider-like limbs, sharp teeth, and that high-pitched, mocking voice, he was something straight out of a real nightmare. The show didn't pull punches. The Boogeyman wasn't a one-episode wonder. He came back again and again. He had history with Egon, one of the Ghostbusters, who as a child was tormented by him. That's right. One of the heroes had trauma, and it came back to haunt him, literally. Did you know that when The Real Ghostbusters aired its first Boogeyman episode in 1986, some networks nearly pulled it for being too frightening? The studio stood firm, because this wasn't just horror, it was therapy. The show taught kids that fear could be faced, that monsters only win when you hide. And the design, those impossible legs, the jagged smile, the electric blue skin, was genius. It didn't look like any one creature you could name. It looked like all of them at once. Even now, decades later, fans still cite the Boogeyman as one of the scariest villains in any cartoon, not because he hurt people, but because he understood them. He wasn't there to destroy cities or steal jewels. He was there to whisper that timeless line, "You can't escape me, I'm in your head." And once he said that, he never really left. The Boogeyman didn't just haunt our childhoods. He defined what haunting meant. Zarm, Captain Planet and the Planeteers. For a show built on saving the Earth, Captain Planet had some surprisingly dark villains. None darker or more complex than Zarm. He wasn't a polluter, a businessman, or a cartoonish corporate crook. Zarm was an idea. Once the spirit of the Earth, he turned against balance and embraced destruction. A fallen force of nature who believed humanity could only thrive through conflict. That's a heavy concept for a Saturday morning cartoon. Zarm wasn't evil in the traditional sense. He was seductive, philosophical. When he spoke, it wasn't in threats. It was in truths twisted into poison. He'd tempt the heroes with visions of power, peace through domination, and victory through violence. Did you know Zarm was voiced by none other than Malcolm McDowell? That smooth, haunting British drawl gave every word a gravitas that made him sound like he was reading scripture in reverse. Later, he'd be voiced by David Warner and even Sting. Yes, that Sting. If you needed to cast fallen angel turned cosmic manipulator, Zarm was your man. He wasn't a cackling madman or a brute with gadgets. He was terrifying because he was right, just enough. Every argument had logic. Every speech sounded convincing. And that's the kind of villain that stays with you. In one unforgettable episode, he wiped out humanity in an alternate timeline just to prove his point. The show didn't sugarcoat it. Zarm's philosophy wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. But even after being defeated, he never really lost. He'd vanish, smirking, knowing humanity would always struggle with the same temptations he embodied. Zarm wasn't the kind of villain you could punch. He was the kind you had to outthink, and that's why he lingers. In a show about saving the planet, Zarm was the perfect shadow, a reminder that destruction doesn't always come from evil, it sometimes comes from belief. Shredder, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. If Saturday mornings had a sound, it would be the clang of metal and the snarl of one unforgettable voice. Shredder. Half samurai, half supervillain CEO, he was the sharpest nightmare ever to slice through 1980s animation. In Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Shredder was the perfect storm of style and rage. A steel-plated nemesis with a vendetta against 4 talking turtles and 1 very calm rat. But he wasn't just a bad guy in armor. He was something more dangerous, a man obsessed with honor and revenge. Oroku Saki, his real name, was a fallen ninja master who turned bitterness into an empire. One moment, he was leading the Foot Clan through the shadows of New York. The next, he was running high-tech operations out of an underground fortress, complete with robot armies and interdimensional partners. Did you know Shredder was inspired by a literal cheese grater? That's right. The show's creators once joked about a villain whose costume was covered in kitchen blades. The joke stuck, and somehow it worked. The armor became iconic, gleaming spikes, flowing cape, and that samurai helmet that made him look like Darth Vader's cousin from Tokyo. And then there was the voice. James Avery, better known as Uncle Phil from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, gave Shredder his unmistakable sound. Deep, commanding, with a touch of frustrated dignity. He didn't just shout orders, he roared them, like a Shakespearean villain trapped in a Saturday morning slot. But beneath the bravado, Shredder was surprisingly complex. He wasn't after money or power, he wanted respect. He saw himself as a warrior wronged, determined to restore his name, even if it meant tearing a city apart. That's why his rivalry with Splinter hit so hard. It wasn't just hero versus villain, it was brother versus brother, honor versus obsession. And while most cartoon villains were doomed to fail every week, Shredder never felt like a joke. He was relentless, stylish, charismatic, the kind of villain who could lose and still look like he'd planned it that way. Even decades later, that helmet still glints in our collective memory, a reminder of when villains had presence, purpose, and plenty of blades to back it up. Shredder wasn't just the Turtles' enemy, he was Saturday morning's dark reflection, a perfect mix of tradition, technology, and pure animated menace. So, there they are, 15 faces from our Saturday morning nightmares, still lurking somewhere in the glow of old TV screens. From Venger's stormy skies to Zarm's twisted philosophies, they weren't just villains, they were lessons in fear, power, and imagination. Maybe that's why they still live rent-free in our memories. Which one haunted your childhood the most? Drop it in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe. Because the next shadow we chase might be darker than you remember.